Hello and welcome to the Library of Chaos. Today we step back into the world of real-life horror. The story I have today is about the Silent Hill-like treatment of the First Nation children at the residential school called St. Anne's. This malignant institution was designed to torture and break the children and separate them from their cultural identity. The majority of this information that I'm going to use in this video comes from the first-hand account of Edmund, I'm going to attempt to pronounce this right, Meditawaban. In his book, Up Ghost Creek, the book tells the story of a child being broken and disconnected from his identity, then returning to home and reconnecting with his people, eventually rising up to lead and bring some justice to those responsible. St. Anne's plays a major role in that book as the place he is broken and the people he brings justice against. I'm not focusing on the story of that book. I am just relaying the horrors that occurred at St. Anne's. I do not have the information or time at the current moment to do that whole story the justice it deserves, but I do recommend you go read it for yourself to find out more information. It's a truly disgusting situation that the First Nations had to be in and are still in to a certain degree. But with all that said, as I'm going to start saying a little bit more, disclaimer, this is going to include some not so fun topics. All that to say, today we will be taking a look and finding out what exactly this horrifying institution was, what they did, and how they tried to break a people. Before we go into the atrocities committed at St. Anne's, we have to understand what St. Anne's was. St. Anne's was a residential school founded in Fort Albany, Ontario, that operated from 1902 to 1976. It took Cree students from the Fort Albany First Nation and the surrounding areas. The residential school program in Canada, specifically is what we are talking about, but it was also present in the United States, was a horrific program that was designed to take First Nation kids from their home and break them from their culture as an attempt to just erase that culture without killing them outright. Still genocide, just not as direct. And St. Anne's was the worst reported of these schools. In the 74 years this school was open, it took Cree kids from the nearby reservations and abused and tortured their culture out of them. Well, attempted. As we will see in later reports and in Up Ghost River. Unfortunately, the school was also sponsored by the Canadian federal government, which meant even if these abuses got reported, it was usually buried or dealt with quietly or blamed on another Native student. So there was some legal recourse. It was an unfortunate state. Sidebar on this, in the investigation into the school, they did subpoena all of the records from the school, and the original case has over 900, like the investigation has 900 different cases of wrongdoing. You know how many were called out and written down in the actual books of the school? 4. There's a discrepancy there. But, all that to say, the interviews and investigations following Meditawaban's reports revealed a lot of what we know about the school now, but that was in 1993, almost 20 years after the school closed, meaning even though the investigators and lawsuits that followed punished some people involved, I think it was 7 people, and the institutions that funded the school and founded it, including the Ontario government. But the majority of these abusers never saw justice and got off scot-free. And the victims never saw justice. And there are sure to be many victims that we will never know about that have been too far buried. One good thing that did come out of the school's terror was a united people. The school was designed to break the Cree kids from their culture and homes. But as these reports showed, and the people coming together with Metawaban to tell these stories, it didn't do that. It gave them a united enemy, and a lot of these kids that went through this process were able to reconnect with their culture and their traditions. Thankfully. Well, that ends this segment on what the actual institution was. Next, we go into what actually happened there. I mentioned that St. Anne's abused and tortured their students, but let's be more specific. I found some reports from the 1993 investigation and the eyewitness accounts of Edmund Metawaban, and they paint some disturbing pictures of what was going down inside those infamous walls. Following Metawaban bringing evidence to the Ottawa Provincial Police to ignite the investigation, the OPP interviewed over 700 witnesses and filed over 900 different statements about assaults, sexual assaults, and wrongful deaths. So I will not be talking about all of them today, but I recommend taking a look at it if you want to learn exactly how messed up the school was, and I will link a report of the investigation in my description. But I will still talk about several of these cases. Let's start with something that Metawaban talked about in the first few chapters of Up Ghost River. On his first day there, he was lined up with a number of boys from the surrounding reservations. First, they are humiliated by being forced to strip down naked in line as they are each handed their outfit that they are supposed to use for the entire year. One set of clothes for the whole year. Then they are told to get dressed so that their hair could be cut, which is something that went against Cree tradition, and when one of the boys spoke up about that, he was taken off and beaten. That was the first day Metawaban was at St. Anne's. It began with humiliation, abuse, and removing part of these kids' cultural identity on the first day. The following is an excerpt from George Barrera's article talking about the investigations. The preteen girls would take turns with the towel in the bathroom at St. Anne's Indian Residential School. One at a time, they would wrap it around their throats and pull it tight. We called it getting high. We'd get dizzy, lightheaded, one of them said nearly 2 decades later on August 3rd, 1993, during an interview with Ontario Provincial Police investigators in room 251 of the Howard Johnson Hotel in London, Ontario. We looked forward to it, said the residential school survivor, whose name is redacted in the OPP's transcript. It was an escape. The woman, by then in her mid-30s, was describing her horrific 9-year stay at the school on Fort Albany First Nation near the James Bay coast as part of an indecent assault investigation of one of its former nuns. What she needed to escape, she told investigators, was the constant strappings and whippings and sexual assaults by the man she knew only as the gardener. This shouldn't have happened to us. They're God's workers. They were there to look after us. So, according to this victim that was interviewed, the preteen girls would asphyxiate themselves as an escape from the horrible acts committed against them. Horrific acts committed by people who are supposed to be nurturing and loving as servants of God. Obviously, the church has a history of not completing that goal, but the fact still remains, to these kids, they were taught that the church was supposed to be good and nurturing, and yet they are going through the worst experience of their lives at the church's hands. And it gets worse. Metawaban, in a number of the statements taken in the OPP investigation, mentioned something right out of a torture porn horror movie. That was the school's liberal use of an electric chair as a form of punishment. Survivors described the electric chair as being high-backed with steel arms, according to court files obtained by the CBC News that included summaries of the allegations in the OPP documents. One former male St. Anne student who attended the school between 1957 and 1962 said a supervising nun would make him sit in an electric chair, tie his wrists to the armrest, and administer shocks. The nun strapped him in the electric chair and electrocuted him until he was semi-conscious, the court file states. A female student who attended the school between 1957 and 1964 alleged she was forced to eat her own vomit and punished by electrocution in the chair. There were also claims in the file that school officials let students use the chair to test endurance and that it was used for fun. A male former student alleged that when he was 6 to 11 years old, he was tricked to sitting on an electric chair in the recreation room by a supervising nun, and an unidentified religious brother operated the crank which caused him to receive shocks, said the file. Those were just a few of the many reports about this thing. This was insane. The fact that it was a homemade creation by someone at the school makes it even worse. It was an implementation of execution that some father or nun saw and decided they want one to punish the kids. Obviously, it wasn't the same level of current, but this is still insanity. The fact that this went on for so long and really without recourse is disgusting. And with all that torture and sexual assault occurring here, you know there has got to be covered up murders, reports of punishment so severe that the kids would die in the process. Like one boy who witnesses say he was forced to run around the track until he had a heart attack. There are others reported to have frozen to death hiding from one of the predators that worked at the school. It is insane how many kids registered at that school are still unaccounted for. They may have died or left, no one really knows, but the patterns of abuse and witness reports of multiple murders occurring there, inference can be made. That was depressing. Let's look at something a little bit happier for a moment before we end off. I want to briefly give an overview of the investigation and what happened to those it was able to implicate. The Ottawa Provincial Police began investigating the school's past and retrieving witness statements following Edmund Metawabin holding a table so that way the Cree people of Albany Fort and the surrounding areas could gather all of their stories into one place. And then he brought those reports and a couple pieces of evidence, such as doctored files and faked reports from the school, and brought them to the police's attention. They began collecting all of these statements and cross-checking medical records against reports until they were able to form over 900 claims and 700 statements professing these events, as well as the school's own files being clearly baked, not even including many of the students on the registrar that could prove they went to the school. So there was clear wrongdoing that made the case a lot stronger. They found 74 suspects and brought criminal cases against 7, 5 of which were convicted for their crimes committed at the school. This began in 1992 and concluded around 2003, whenever they finally got all of the trials through, all of the reports done, and it was a finished, closed case. But the federal government proceeded to omit those files from St. Anne's record in the school registry that allows the reservations to make claims against the schools. They weren't there, even though they received those files in 2003. It took until 2014, a number of important cases and landmark decisions in the Canadian Supreme Court, to finally require the government to release those files to the survivors of the school and fix the record for St. Anne's. Not the justice these people deserved, but justice was still attained somewhat through the determination of Edmund Metawabin and the Cree people of Albany Fort. Thank you for allowing me to share with you this real-world horror story and its painful effects. I have been your curator and your guide. Farewell until next time from the Library of Chaos.